Paul Graham asked me to speak, and I said, all right, well, what should I talk about? And Paul said, you should talk about when you were powerless and obscure. So that's me, powerless and obscure, in the audience. And I guess the central theme of my talk today is I really think it's not impossible to be on stage 2 years from now. I mean, and you'll see from my story, it's not impossible.
Many people would say that, or a number of people said it's the worst idea that ever worked. Or at least I can say everyone at the time seemed to say it was the worst idea ever, and it worked, so maybe that's the nice connection. It's the worst idea that ever worked.
So the story starts in 2004. I went to the Rhode Island School of Design, and I went with my co-founder and my best friend at RISD, Joe Gebbia.
The school had a profound impact on me, probably much like here in Stanford, because growing up, you're taught to look straight ahead. Growing up, you don't get rewarded for being disruptive. You just go to the principal's office, and I was there quite often. And so got to RISD, and teachers were like, you're a designer. You can redesign everything around you. You can, basically they're saying is you can change the world. That's not something that most parents tell their kids. You can change the world. They tell you to behave. I ended up, one other thing happened at RISD. I met one of my co-founders at RISD named Joe Gebbia. And we were like the two entrepreneurs on campus. We ran like these sports clubs. I ran the hockey team. He ran the basketball team. By the way, that's the biggest marketing challenge in the world, to get an art student to go to a hockey game. And our hockey games were like these unbelievable events. We got the mayor of the city to be our honorary coach. The games were became so popular that like students from Brown were coming to the RISD. And by the way, if you don't know the RISD hockey team, it was created in the 1960s, and the team is called the Nads. So when you cheer, you go Nads, go Nads. And so that was the team I was taking over. We succeeded my junior year of having a perfect 0-16 season. So, and that was pretty much my hockey career at RISD. And so the day of graduation, I remember Joe looked at me, and the reason I knew Joe is he ran the basketball team, and they were of course called the Balls. Because they had and I think their tagline was, when the heat is on, the balls stick together. I'm not making this up. This is all the Rhode Island School of Design, so you know. And the reason the sports teams were actually popular beyond the mascots or whatever was that it was the one opportunity the entire school came together. Because like, you go to a big university and everyone goes to the football game or they go to the whatever. And at art school, there's 18 departments and everyone like knows what they want to do for their life. So they just want to be in the studio only doing that. It's not like a liberal arts school where people may be discovering themselves and not sure what they want to do.
Right.
So the day of graduation, Joe looks at me and says, Brian, I think one day we're going to start a company together. You know, we had been kind of rivals, but we had done an internship together at MIT. And so we thought maybe we'd start a company together.
And the day of graduation, Joe looks at me and he says, Brian, I think we're going to start a company together. So I said, well, I already have a job. I'll see you. So I went to Los Angeles, and poor Joe was stuck back in Providence, Rhode Island.
And at that point, I finally succeeded in getting my job with health insurance in Los Angeles, California, as in a tiny design firm. Well, I'm living in LA, working as an industrial designer. I remember my life, and you may be confronting these decisions, where everything in front of me in my life would look like everything behind me. In other words, the road is like a disappearing road into the horizon. It kind of terrified me, because it was that job with health insurance. And at RISD, I was told, no, I can do anything. I can change the world, and you're not doing that. And so I had this impulsive moment where I go into work, and my roommate, or my friend Joe at RISD, was trying to like convince me to leave my company and go to San Francisco, and we were going to start a company.
He calls me up, and he says he's got this apartment, his roommate has moved out, and he says, Brian, let's start a company. And I said, okay, let's start a company.
We had no idea what this company was going to be. We just thought, we'll think of the big idea. And so one day, I go to work, I quit my job, and I'm living in a house with a bunch of friends that moved across the country with me. And I say, okay, guys, I'm going to leave. And they thought I had like an early life crisis. They thought like they need to have an intervention. I'm like, no, I'm fine. And I took some old foam mattress, I rolled it up in the backseat of an old Honda Civic, and with $1,000 at the bank, I drive up to San Francisco. This is October 2007.
Drove up to San Francisco, and Joe tells me the rent's $1,150, and I have $1,000 in the bank account. And I said, I probably should have asked about that before I moved up.
It turns out that weekend I was in San Francisco, this international design conference was actually coming to San Francisco. It's called IDSA, Industrial Designers Society of America. We wanted to go to this conference because we figured we're designers. We're going to start a design company. Maybe we can meet and network with other designers. Yeah. And so we went on the conference website, and they've got this like hotel section. And we look in the hotel section, and all the hotels they were recommending are sold out. So it's like the Marriott sold out, the Hyatt sold out, sold out, sold out, sold out.
And at RISD, it's Rhode School of Design, it's an art school, they really teach you that creativity can solve problems. If you're creative and you identify an everyday problem that you deal with, you can actually solve that.
And so Joe and I, we kind of look at each other and we say, well, why don't we just create a bed and breakfast for this conference? That seems like it makes sense. We got all this extra space. And so Joe had 3 airbeds. He had gone camping and he had kept some airbeds. And we pulled the airbeds out of the closet. We inflated the airbeds and we called it the Airbed and Breakfast. And that's where the name comes from, airbedandbreakfast.com. So a lot of people hear the name, they think it's like Air is like the platform and BB is the house. No, it's just airbeds. That's all this was. This was just airbeds.
And in literally 30 minutes, we built this as we were talking. And I don't know, I'm not here to give lessons except to say if you have an idea, just put something out there in 20, 30 minutes. Don't worry how bad it looks. Our first launch, our first of many, was this. And this is a site that 2 designers had built. Looks pretty modest today.
This is the first version of Airbed and Breakfast. We made this in 24 hours. We had a site up, and we encountered our next problem, which is how are people going to find out about Airbed and Breakfast? So that night before bed, Brian and I, we emailed the top design bloggers that we could think of. And when we woke up the next morning, there we were at the top of some of our favorite blogs, Swiss Miss, Course 77, Unbeige. And suddenly, this idea that we had 48 hours earlier was now live on the internet. We had people start writing us from around the world who wanted to stay in our living room. So think for a minute. What type of person do you think would sleep on an airbed in somebody's living room? Probably dudes, probably pretty young, strapped for cash just out of college. That's what we thought too. We were totally wrong. We had 3 people stay with us, all over the age of 30. Kat, Amol, and Michael.
We ended up hosting 3 people from around the world, a 35-year-old woman from Boston, a 45-year-old father of 5 from Utah, and a 30-year-old from India.
Hi, I'm Amol, and I'm the first ever guest on Airbnb. Back in 2007, there was this huge international design conference that was happening in San Francisco, and I was really late for doing the registration for the conference.
And the only way that I could actually go for the conference was if I could find a cheap place to stay.
You went to the chocolate talk, right? You came to that talk. Yeah. You even helped me with the presentation, didn't you?
I think, yeah, we did.
Yeah, you helped me make a presentation.
My first experience with Airbnb was I'm sitting on this couch, and in front of me there is Brian and Joe who are preparing for their Pecha Kucha presentation. And I'm the guest, and they are actually talking about this entire experience at that point.
It's for me? Yeah. Who's it?
And I'm actually in that experience, sitting in that room and watching them prepare for the presentation. So it was very interesting. It's amazing to see the growth of Airbnb. I never expected that it will grow so fast and in such an amazing way.
I couldn't actually find a photo of Michael, but anyways, this 45-year-old father of 5 from Utah slept on an airbed in my living room. Well, we came up with the idea it would be an airbed and breakfast because all the hotels are sold out. It wasn't going to be a designer. We wanted to originally do a design bed and breakfast, but I actually didn't have any furniture. Remember, I had moved up there. But Joe said he had some airbeds, and that's where the name came to.
We made our rent that month. We made $1,000, right? They saved our apartment, but they actually did more than that. Collectively, the 3 of them inspired us to make Airbed and Breakfast real.
And so this was our first launch.
Now, I got to tell you, the reason we started doing this is because we thought it was funny, cool, and we make money, because we had to make rent. There's something that happens, though. When somebody lives with you, it's kind of like the arc of a friendship gets contracted from a year to a day. In other words, if you were to meet somebody, maybe here at Stanford or in the real world, and you get to know them, how much time does it take to invite them over to your house and have dinner with them? It might take months, even a year. You don't just get to know people. And what it did, we realized, is it contracted this year-long friendship into a couple days. And so these people came as strangers. They literally left as friends. We ended up keeping in touch with them. In fact, one of the guests ended up inviting me to his wedding. The other guest, this woman, moves from Boston to San Francisco, and I think we're realizing there's a bigger idea here. I asked Joe, I said, who's the best engineer you know? Because Joe and I were designers. Joe could do front-end design, engineering, but we were both designers and product people. And Joe said, well, my old roommate Nate is. Nate, Joe met on Craigslist. He went to Harvard, he's a computer scientist. And so the 3 of us got together and we said, we basically had this core idea. We said, what if you could book someone's home the way you could book a hotel anywhere in the world? And that's basically how it started. The one caveat I'll make to the story is after that very first weekend, there wasn't this flash that, oh my God, this is going to be huge. We actually didn't do anything for 4 months. In fact, the thing we don't usually talk about is after that, we started exploring creating a roommate matching website. Because we thought no one would ever do this Airbed and breakfast thing, but people need roommates. And we thought roommates meets Craigslist meets Facebook, like roommates with profiles. Until one day we typed roommates.com in and realized somebody had built that site. And this was like 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, and I said, why the hell did anyone type that site in the first day? Because I just wasted 4 weeks. So we didn't know what to do. We went home for Christmas, and people were like, what are you working on? And I'm like, I didn't want to tell everyone in my family I was unemployed. So I said, I'm an entrepreneur. Of course, my mom said, you're actually unemployed. I said, no, I'm actually an entrepreneur. And that's also when I learned when you're starting out, the difference between unemployed and being an entrepreneur is in your head. It's usually a mindset. And I was, in my head, an entrepreneur. And they said, well, what are you entrepreneuring? And I'm like, because it wasn't really a common word there. And I said, well, I got this thing, Airbed and breakfast. They're like, Airbed and what? And we just started to get used to pitching it. We're like, maybe we should actually do this. And it was still not obvious. The original idea was Airbeds for conferences. So we ended up launching at South by Southwest in 2008. And the whole idea was if you're going to a conference, you don't have a lot of money, you could sleep in someone's home on their airbed. And we ended up with the second version of the website we built, and we had 2 customers, and I was one of them. So that's kind of how it started. And it was, frankly, it wasn't the Facebook story, 2 weeks, it was a longer road.
And a couple months later, South by Southwest was coming up, and we decided, why don't we build a site where you can basically provide airbeds for conferences all over the United States. We'll do what we did for that conference for conferences all over the country. And it turned out that launching for South by Southwest, we thought, would be the best time to do it, because that is basically one of the preeminent tech events. I asked Joe, I said, Joe, who's the best engineer you know? He said his old roommate Nate is. And so in March of 2008, we did our second launch, and it looked like this: airbeds for conferences. And that's our traffic. You know, a few months had gone by, and 3 things happened at that conference. The first thing is I show up, and by the way, we didn't have payments at the time. So I show up, and I forgot to go to the ATM. So I show up to this guy's house. He lets me in. We have dinner together. And then he says, all right, he's kind of uncomfortable. He's like, all right, it's going to be $200. And I'm like, oh, can I get to you tomorrow? It's really awkward. Here I am, a guy, some stranger now sleeping in his living room. And he's like, what the hell did I get myself into here? The second thing happened is I met a couple people, and one of the people said, Brian, I'd love to go use your product. I'm going to London, but there's no conference. So we said, that's kind of limiting. Why should it only be for conferences? And the third thing was we met this guy right here, Michael Seibel. Michael Seibel is the CEO of Justin.tv. You know, before we came up here, I didn't know anything about even Y Combinator, TechCrunch. I was an industrial designer working out of Los Angeles. And Michael basically informally brought us into the YC community. I'm not sure if I should tell you to reach out to YC alumni without going through the program, but I actually did. It worked out really well. Michael basically channeled his inner Paul Graham. He was basically giving us advice, taught us the YC methodology. We called him the God Founder.
And I assume you didn't know anything about like how venture capital works.
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, I didn't know what angels were. Michael Seibel, I ended up like one of our early advisors was Michael Seibel, and he says, I have these people named angels that can meet you. And I'm like, oh my God, this guy's crazy. He believes in angels. He goes, no, don't worry. There's these guys, you can have dinner with them. You could like over dinner get a check for $20,000. And I'm like, well, I was living in LA. I don't want that kind of relationship either. And he's like, no. That's not what I mean. Angels, like you give them a pitch, a slide deck. I'm like, what the hell is a slide deck? So then he like sends me like Sequoia's like slide deck template, and it's like 15 slides. I'm like, oh, so all I have to do is make 15 slides. So I make these 15 slides into a slide deck based on Sequoia's template, and Joe and I have like no idea what we want to do, and we have like total market size. We guessed like $30 million. And
was that based on anything, or you were just...
I mean, yeah, we basically imagined how much we thought a room would be. We had the model of taking 10%, and then we made a giant guess of how many people may one day, this is called Airbed and Breakfast, would want to rent out their airbeds every night. And then, of course, I remember meeting up with, I think, at some point, like Sam Altman, and he said to me, you got to change the M's to B's. Investors want B's, not M's. And so the night before one of our investor pitches, we changed all the M's to B's. And suddenly the market size was like huge, except we were still selling airbeds. And so like, we're gonna make $30 billion with these airbeds. Everyone's gonna live on airbeds. That pitch did not work out so well somehow.
Who was your first pitch in Silicon Valley?
I think the first pitch we gave, okay, so Michael Seibel is, as you know, he founded Social Cam before that, jusqu'à TV. I ended up actually meeting him in South by Southwest because I stayed on Airbnb. We built the site for South by Southwest in 2008, and I had never even heard of South by Southwest. Like, I was just totally new to all this. And I remember we had 2 reservations that time, and I was one of them. So I was shocked that like there was someone else doing this. I'm like, oh, amazing. And and I stayed with this guy, Tiandong, and he of course blows up this airbed. He had like these pillows and a mint on the top. I'm like, my God, this guy takes Airbnb more seriously than I do. And I started the website. And of course, I forgot to like bring money. At the time, we didn't have payments. It was really awkward because this guy's like, this like stranger is sleeping in my apartment. I haven't paid him. Does he just build websites to freeload off his community? And so we realized, Joe and I, like, we got to build a payment system. I end up meeting Michael Seibel. He's staying in a hotel room. The meeting was actually pretty funny because he tells me to come up to his hotel room, and I open the door, walk into his hotel room, and he's sitting in his bed, and he's like really comfortable. He himself is also in these tighty whities. There's this like recurring story of tidy whities, by the way. I don't know what it is. Watching a special.
Well, and you also wore Speedos, I imagine,
yeah, there you
bodybuilding.
Go. So there you go. So there's something
there's
weird
a lot
going
of nudity in this story.
He's watching a special on John Wilkes Booth on the History Channel, and proceeds to ask me to like pitch him on what Airbnb is. And at some point, I kind of forgot where I was and just pitched him like normally, and I'm like telling him the story of the company, all this, and at some point it occurred to me, and I'm hearing the background, and they pursued him through the forest, and like there's just this like story of like John Wilkes Booth going on in the background, but like I completely tuned it out. And so this is Michael Seibel tells me, there are these people named Angels. I'm like, you're crazy. He goes, no, you got to meet these people. And so he emails like I think 20 people: Ron Conway, Aydin Senkit, George Herrick, Mike Maples, Jeff Clavier, all these people. And I'd say of the 20 people he introed, I think only like 8 of them wrote me back. So most of them didn't write me back. Of the 8 that wrote me back, probably like 3 or 4 of them said this doesn't fit our investment thesis or something like that, or we're concerned with the size of the market, a whole bunch of things. And I think we end up getting a meeting with a few of them. Maybe they'll remain nameless. One of them, I met him in University Cafe, and he ordered a smoothie. He was drinking half his smoothie, and he gets up halfway through and just left. Like, it was just like the worst idea he's ever heard of. And it was so absurd.
Did he say goodbye?
I don't think he even said goodbye. And then Joe and I were just sitting there like, what the hell just happened? So we ended up taking a photo of the smoothie. Like so it just seemed really funny that he would like leave. He's like, all right, okay, I gotta go. And then we ended up meeting with some other investors, and they said, I remember them saying, we're concerned with the size of the market and your lack of a technical team. And I understood the maybe size of the market, but they were concerned with the lack of a technical team. And I said, well, we're designers, and we think design's like really important. And they're like, you know, people like, I don't know, they didn't really appreciate this. So at this point, we're like, we're gonna have to go it alone. By the way, this is like 6 or 8 months after I had no money. So the money I have is just debt. Like, I get a credit card. I get a $5,000 limit, so I use it until I swipe and they say I can't use it anymore. So I get another credit card. I have a $5,000 limit.
Did anyone from the 20 people he emailed invest?
No.
Okay.
No one wanted to touch this, and no one invested, and I didn't even get close. Like, this was like a crazy idea. They're like, yeah, you got to stay with this.
You didn't even get a whole smoothie.
No, I didn't get a whole smoothie. So Joe and I just start funding the company with credit cards. Do you know those binders that that you put baseball cards in? So we put credit cards in those.
How do you keep getting cards? This is the problem with debt in America.
I don't know.
Like personified.
I don't know. So we have these sleeves of credit cards, and at some point, I was like, I remember I used to like go to sleep at night, like having convinced myself over the course of the day that like everything I was doing made sense and I was really smart. And I remember I would like sleep, and then like I'd wake up like, I'm such an idiot, what the hell am I doing? How did I get here? And then I proceeded to like convince myself over the course of the day that everything was fine. And I had this like continued cycle of waking up in panic. This is the summer of 2008. We end up launching for the Democratic National Convention. Because I remember Joe and I are sitting in the middle of our living room, and we're trying to figure out, we have this like chicken and egg problem. Like, travelers want to go where there's homes, and people want to list their homes where travelers are going. So how do you actually start that? And the big problem we have is we wanted to be a site like with a search bar. Where are you going? So you can go anywhere. So how do you solve this chicken and egg problem in every city in the world at the same time? And my being naive seemed like I didn't actually think all of that through. Like I didn't think about how hard it would be to get a network effect business going early on. I just figured, like Facebook grew in 2 weeks, it's going to be easy for us. And of course, we launch it and like no one's coming and they think it's a weird social experiment. They don't want to do it. And I think at the time I didn't even know what couchsurfing was. So I like discovered couchsurfing because I would tell people and they're like, isn't this like couchsurfing? And I'm like, couchsurfing? Interesting. What is that? And I'm like, oh, that's free. Interesting. It's like housing for me now. So I'm in the living room and the Democratic National Convention is starting. And Barack Obama, they move him from a 20,000 seat Pepsi Center to an 80,000 seat football stadium, which you guys may remember, Invesco Field. All these news channels all of a sudden were like totally blowing it out of proportion, like DNC housing crisis, like Fox News is like the housing crisis of the century, where are they gonna stay, da da da. And so all these people were like doing stories about like this housing supply problem. And we're like, Airbnb's where they're going to stay. Of course, we would email CNN, and no, it would just go into some dark hole. So we realized maybe we'll start with smaller bloggers. We would find, like, we had this principle. We felt like the smaller they were, the more likely they were to pay attention to us. So we found bloggers that had no traffic, like 3 readers. And it was like a
that is a good strategy for getting the word out.
And it was like a 9th grader, and she was like, you know. So we'd email them, we've got this awesome idea. And so she would write about it, and then other bloggers would write about it. And what happens is we did like an inverse pyramid. We started with the very smallest bloggers, and they actually want to talk to us, and they would tell our story. And then a little bit bigger bloggers would Google you and see if other smaller bloggers are talking about you. And so then they would write articles. And then eventually we got the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News when they were still around, and they wrote articles about us. And then I typed in DNC housing and Google News. I saw TV reporters were writing about it. And somebody did a story about somebody who was using it to pay college, and I write the report. I'm like, I've got 50 people that are doing this for I would email the users why are you doing this? They tell me. I'm like, look at all these stories I got. So I try to almost write the story for them.
Right.
And then we got on the local NBC News, and when we got on the local NBC News, I mean, as far as I was concerned, we were the Beatles. We were just huge because I didn't have any sense of proportion of where we were and how many steps later would be even here, and we still have so much more work to go. So I was like, oh my God, we're gonna be on television. And so in a matter of 2 weeks, we went from 3 guys in an apartment with no business, no money, and no press, to 3 guys in an apartment with still no business and no money, but we were on New York Times, we were in CNN, and we just started getting all this press.
And you had 50 people who were willing to give to inflate mattresses. So you didn't have such a problem with convincing those people. It was getting people to fill those mattresses.
Yeah, I mean, at the point in which the conference had started, the housing crisis, the economy just collapsed. Bear Stearns, the whole thing had happened, and so
partially because of people like you who had $40,000 in credit card debt and no means of paying it.
Well, probably more like housing crisis, but
no one gave you a mortgage.
Yes, exactly. No one sold me a mortgage, and I wouldn't have taken that, so I was smart enough not to do that. We're trying to figure out how to get people to stay, and we end up, I think, having 80 people that end up staying in Denver, and I stayed. I used the site. We launched on TechCrunch. It was August 11th, 2008. I remember that date. And we launched, and I thought we were going to be huge. And then I read the comments section, and I just realized
Never do that.
I mean, no, people just I was wow, maybe I am an idiot. After reading the comment, and I'm like, no, I can't possibly. People I just couldn't believe how
What were some of the things that
it was
people
all
said
you're serial killers, and this is the worst idea ever, and who the hell is going to do this, and this is the dumbest idea ever, And then I remember we went to a pitch for Mike Maples. Oh, he was one of the ones that eventually met with us.
Was he the smoothie?
No, he was not smoothie.
Okay.
In Mike Maples' defense, that meeting did not go well. So we used to have a slide deck, but I'm like, this is awesome. We launched, we're on TechCrunch. We should do a demo of the site. So we left the slide deck at home, and we just said, we're just going to show a demo. So we get to his office, we set up the screen, but we had just launched in TechCrunch and hadn't realized that when you launch on TechCrunch, it provides enough traffic to take your website down. So our website was down, and we had no slide deck the entirety of the presentation. And so Joe's just trying to get the website up, and I'm just sitting there so, how are things? And that was about it. And for an hour, actually.
I'm going to guess he didn't invest.
He did not invest. That did not go well. But we went to Denver. I thought that was really good. And then the weekend after Denver, it was Paul Graham talks about have this They call it the tech crunch of initiation. You get this huge spike of traffic, and then you have the, the week after, like for the DNC, it went and crashed. And I realized, wow, if only there were political conventions every week, this would be an awesome business. But there's not, and I don't know what to do.
If only there were political conventions every week, we'd be huge. So we're sitting in our apartment, and we realize, well, I don't want to wait till 2012 to get more reservations. This is where the story kind of goes on a weird sidetrack. We had a lot of time on our hands, let's just say that. In other words, when you build a product, a marketplace, and no one uses your marketplace, you have a lot of time. So we had a lot of time on our hands, and we're sitting in the kitchen one day. By the way, we had also provided housing for a Republican National Convention. No one went to that. We got, I think, one booking. So we have a lot of time on our hands. We're in the kitchen. We're like, what if we made a breakfast that we could send to the people hosting? It's like a nice exchange. Well, we're not going to send them eggs. It's not going to be a perishable. And so obviously, we thought, let's send them a breakfast cereal. We're just having fun. By the way, as I said, we had a lot of time on our hands. And we're thinking, what would an Obama-themed cereal be called? We just are basically joking around. We decide, we come up with this name we think is hilarious. We create this product we call Obama O's, the breakfast of change. We also had hope in every bowl. I like that one too.
And that's when we became what we call serial entrepreneurs. Joe and I literally were assembling these boxes in our kitchen. I mean, basically we had 1,000 boxes. It's like poster board. And we're assembling them with hot glue. And by the way, they shouldn't call it hot glue. They should call it burn glue because it's hot. And I had a perfect 1-to-1 ratio of burn to box. And there were 1,000 of these boxes. And I remember we were gluing all these boxes. We didn't have any cereal. So we'd go to the grocery store to get cereal, but we didn't even have enough money to buy all the cereal boxes. So we would go every night to buy 50 boxes.
At this point, Nate, our engineer, thinks Joe and I are out of our minds. He's like, what the hell are you doing designing breakfast cereal? You are out of your mind. So we designed the cereal, but then we get distracted because the DNC is coming up, and we're like, no, it's going to be huge. We're going to blow up. But we don't blow up. No one wants to use the site after that weekend. And most people think we're kind of crazy. My mom thinks I'm out of my mind. All of our friends, later tell us they thought we were crazy. At the time, they're just like, oh, okay, let's see how that goes. And so Joe and I are in the middle of the kitchen one night thinking, let's just make that cereal. And so we call it Kellogg's. And Kellogg's surprisingly doesn't return our calls. And then we call up these really small cereal companies. And they return our calls and say, yeah, sure, we'll make cereal boxes for you. And it's we just need a deposit for $200,000, no big deal, this and that. We're that's not going to work either. And I remember us doing math, if we sell 200,000 boxes, maybe that would be the same as if those angels had given us money. It would be a cereal round or something. We could be serial entrepreneurs. And so we don't have any money, so this is a problem.
You're beyond not having money.
Yeah, I know, we're beyond not having money. We can't even get more credit cards. So we have this cereal box is going to get us out of debt. It's going to get us back to zero, which is also not an inspiring place to get to. Zero. So we end up having this idea. We said, well, Press worked last time. When we emailed Press, they wrote about us. What if we can scrounge up enough money to make 100 boxes of cereal and mail them to Press? Because Press, they get 800 emails a day.
Right.
But
we love food.
They do not get Obama's and Captain McCain's on their desk. And we figured if we send it to the newsrooms, people would put the swag on their desk and all the other reporters would walk by and see it. Mm-hmm. So that was our idea.
So we designed this box. Mostly, as I said, we had a lot of time on our hands. But then we started realizing this is a really cool design. We want to sell this. But we needed a gimmick so people would find out about this. So we made a video, and we actually got a guy to make us a jingle.
There's a really cool cereal that you ought to know. Everybody's talking about Obama O's. Just one bite and you will understand. Cause every single O sings, yes we can. Oh my God, it's Obama O's. Mommy, can I have some please?
By the way, I know what you're thinking. We had a web startup, now we're making cereal. Yeah. Well, we had no traffic, so. A company from San Francisco that wants to be an open platform, you got to be very careful if you're only doing things for Democrats, right? We wanted people from all over the world to use us. So we said if we make a Barack Obama-themed cereal, we have to make a John McCain-themed cereal. And we're thinking, what would a John McCain-themed cereal be called? Reading about him on Wikipedia, we find out he was a captain in the Navy, and that's when we came up with Captain McCain's. a maverick in every bite. And as you can predict, we got a jingle made for that as well.
Captain McCain's have all the squares you need to succeed. Captain McCain's are not round, no, they are squares.
So we make these boxes of cereal. We think maybe this could be the solution to us not having any money or any traffic. We still believed in Airbnb, but we had no traffic, and we thought if we can make like 100,000 boxes of these and sell them for $2 a box, that would be able to fund our company. We had this thing we knew people wanted. They didn't want the website, but they wanted the cereal. Unfortunately, I think I was $15,000 or $20,000 in credit card debt. 4 different cards, $5,000 each. So we certainly couldn't pay for cereal. We meet this guy in Berkeley. He turns out to be an alumni of RISD. He says, I'm not going to make you 100,000 boxes, but I'm willing to print you because I like you guys and I want to help out another alumni, 500 boxes each of John McCain cereal and Barack Obama themed cereal. So we realized, well, we're not going to make a lot of money unless we charge a lot. So we said, well, if we call it limited edition, we can charge a lot. So we charge $40 a box, and we literally got 1,000 boxes of cereal printed. They're just flat, right? And you've got to assemble them yourself. Joe and I assembled them in our kitchen, and I'm not joking. I mean, we actually went to the grocery store and bought 1,000 boxes of cereal. We would buy out.
We didn't have enough money to buy real cereal, so we ended up going to like the most ghetto grocery store where I had to be Joe's spotter. Like I had to go in the grocery store with him because I didn't want to make sure he got robbed in the grocery store because we had to go a place where you could find like $1 box of cereal. Mm-hmm. So we ended up stuffing the box of cereal and we ended up mailing it to press. We get all this attention. Jonathan's like jingles were like really popular. We end up selling out in like 3 days all of the Obama O's and not so many Captain McCain's.
He put up this website, the jingles, CNN discovers it. And CNN runs a story. And we end up selling out in like 2 days, $20,000 worth of Obama O's. People started reselling the Obama O's on Craigslist and eBay. And when I realized, Joe, we didn't charge enough. Damn it. Some time passes. We pay off our debt, but our website still has no traffic. This is where people make a pivot, and we're like, this is working, but we don't want to make cereal the rest of our life. So we're going to go back to the website. We're running out of money again, and this is a low point for me. I'm just going to make a confession because I haven't really talked about this before. We're in our kitchen. We had no money. We had no food. And I wake up one morning, and I go into the kitchen, and I have no food, I have no money, and I'm like, what am I going to do? I have to eat. Well, luckily, we didn't sell that many Captain McCain's. So for 2 or 3 months, we lived off Captain McCain's. So this is actually from Paul Graham. He's got this graph on Y Combinator, and he says basically after your launch, you think you're going to make it, and then you crash, and you've got this long trough of sorrows, and that's what happened with us.
You know, people ask now, like, why did you keep going forward? And I think it's 2 reasons. The first was probably because we, like, you know, we had each other.
Yeah.
And I do think, like, when a lot of, like, solo founders, I think the hardest part about being a solo founder is every idea is in your head. You can't actually talk it through, and you have no one to lean on. And being a founder, even with co-founders, is incredibly lonely and solitary. You just feel, like, very alone. The other reason, I think, why we believed in it was because of that very first weekend. You see, I knew that that weekend was so incredibly special, that we had these connections, these relationships, that changed my life, and it changed their lives. They were amazing. And all we said is, all people have to do is experience what we experienced. If they would experience what we experienced, then this is going to happen all over the world. We didn't know how many people, but we said we're ordinary guys. There's got to be other ordinary people like us, people with a little extra space that want to make some extra money. There has to be. And so that was the thing. We had experienced it. Maybe we weren't visionaries. Maybe we were more like expeditionaries. And we discovered something, and then we pursued that, knowing that we wouldn't quit. So quitting never was something we'd ever considered. But the days got really, really hard. I remember one night, this is 13, 14 months in, without any money. I wake up, I go to the kitchen, I'm opening all of our cupboards, and there's like nothing but like ketchup and like just, there's no food in the kitchen. And I'm just like so hungry. I'm like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? And I look over, and luckily we had like 300 boxes of Captain McCain's. And until Y Combinator, Joe and I were like living off of Captain McCain's.
Thank God he wasn't popular.
I know. So at this point, like Michael Seibel says, you have to apply to Y Combinator. And the next batch of Y Combinator was happening in January. I'm like, why are we gonna apply to Y Combinator? We've been in TechCrunch, we're huge.
Right.
And he's like, even though we knew we weren't. And he's like, guys, like, look at you, you're dying. Like, I was like literally like wasting away. And he's like, you should apply to Y Combinator.
Well, so this is what I find strange. And maybe Y Combinator was like less high profile then, but it's pretty easy to raise an angel round in Silicon Valley. And like, you couldn't even do that, but you thought you'd get into Y Combinator? That seems harder.
Justin Kahn, Michael Seibel, Emmett said that they would put in a good word for us, and they thought, you said you should apply. Maybe you could do it. And the other issue was a lot of investors didn't want to deploy any capital because the economy, like they were just scared of deploying capital. But Paul Graham had already committed to deploying the capital, so we figured, well.
So you knew someone was getting in.
Yeah, we figured he's got to give money to somebody.
Right.
Why not us? And so that like it was just this like really naive idea, and we filled out the application. We ended up getting an interview, and like we convinced Nate to like fly out. By the way, at this point, Nate had moved back to Boston, had gotten engaged. If you know anything about like starting a company with co-founders, like when your co-founder moves 3,000 miles away and gets engaged to somebody who like wants to settle in Boston, that's generally not a good sign for your startup.
Right. Was it when you started gluing together 1,000 cereal boxes that he left?
He's like, all right, I'm out of here. Which is funny because I remember at one point my mom asked me, so are you starting a cereal, do you run a cereal company now? And I had to actually think about that for a while because technically I was.
Yes.
Technically I was. I remember I used to go home for Christmas telling everyone I was an entrepreneur, and my mom said, no, you're unemployed. And I'm like, no, I'm an entrepreneur. And she's like, no, you're unemployed. And so that's when I realized being an entrepreneur is often a state of mind, because before you have business, there's a very fine line. As far as I was concerned, I was an entrepreneur. We're about to go to the YC interview, and like we knew this was like our last shot. Like if I didn't get into YC, I was at the end of the rope, and I didn't know what that even meant. Like I didn't know what to do. Like what do I do without any money, in huge debt? And like I don't have like what I probably considered Silicon Valley employable skills. Like I had to I was an industrial designer, and like I didn't know what to do.
And what had you learned at this point, like from what had gone wrong from your other pitches? Were you savvier about how to do a pitch at this point?
At this point, there were no more changing M's to B's and like selling a big dream. We wanted to know every single thing we could about our company and our community. So we said, we are going to know our community inside and out, everything about it. And so we would, Joe, Nate, and I would like pretend to play good cop, bad cop. Like you'd have to like, you'd sit in a chair, you'd memorize everything, and then I would go in, quick, how many active users do we have? And like Joe would come up and like slam the phone book down. Like this is what we imagine like a Y Combinator interview to be like.
Like Law and Order.
Yeah, exactly, like a Law and Order. Because we heard these YC interviews are like 10 minutes. They're really intense. They fire questions at you. So we basically proceeded to create like a Law and Order episode. And that
I assume this also happened in your kitchen. It seems like every seminal moment. The half-naked guy, the hot glue gun.
Yes, it all happened in our kitchen. And so then we're about to go to YC for the interview, and then Joe takes a box each of Obama O's and Captain McCain's. And he goes to put them in his bag because he wants to give them to Paul Graham. And Nate's like, no, you are not bringing out the cereal. Like, keep the cereal home. Joe's like, okay, fine, I'll keep the cereal home. And he sneaks the cereal in the box, and he doesn't tell Nate. So we drive down, and I remember the interview probably wasn't going well, because the first question Paul Graham asked me is, people are actually doing this? And I go, yeah. And he goes, why? What's wrong with them? And I was like, this interview is not going to go well. And then like we go through our story, and he's pretty impressed that we like seem to know a lot, but I can tell it's not going well. So he's like, all right, thanks. The interview's over. We're about to leave. And then Joe pulls out the boxes of Obama O's and Captain McCain's and gives it to him. And Nate's like, oh my God, I'm out of here. And Paul goes, oh, thanks. Because he thought we were just like bought him those. And like, he's like, what the hell is this? You're like buying me like swag? And like, no, we made this. This is how we funded the company. He goes, what? You made this? So we tell him this whole story. And he says like, wow, you guys are like cockroaches. You just won't die. And I found out later that's apparently a compliment, or so he says. Because in an investment nuclear winter, you want cockroaches, people that won't die.
In Silicon Valley, cockroaches are good.
Exactly. And so I remember later on, he eventually told me he accepted us. And the reason he accepted us is he said, if you can convince people to pay $40 a box for a $4 box of cereal, you probably convince people to sleep on other people's airbeds. Maybe you can do it. So I remember like we're driving back from San Francisco, and he says, I'll call you if you get in.
Did you think you had gotten in?
No, I didn't think it was going well. And I remember seeing my phone ring, and it's his number. And then all of a sudden, there's a point like between Silicon Valley and San Francisco where there's like no cell phone signal. And I'm like, and he basically is gonna say like we give you the offer, but you gotta like accept on the spot, and if you don't, like we just go down the list and we go to the next person. It's like pretty like intimidating. I'm like, Jesus. But we had no other options, so I'm like, fine. So I pick up the phone, and he goes, hey Brian, this is Paul Graham. So I'd love to. I'm like, no! And then like me and Joe were like freaking out. And then like Joe's like, okay, go, go. We're like trying to like drive as fast as possible, like weaving through traffic to get to somewhere with signal. And I'm like, oh my God, I just like ruined it. Like now we definitely have no chance. So we finally get back to San Francisco, and then my phone rings again. He tells us we got in. And he like calls us, okay, do you want to be in? And I'm like, oh, let me think about it. And I like put ourselves on mute. I'm like, do we have any options? Nope. Okay, so we end up joining Y Combinator, and it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me.
Well, what's the first day of Y Combinator like? Because I imagine you guys are very different.
The first day of Y Combinator is Joe, Nate, and I come into a giant room with a whole bunch of, actually not a whole bunch.
So Nate stuck with you, he didn't go back.
Nate had agreed to do Y Combinator because we called him, and it was like 3 in the morning in Boston, and he apparently was half asleep and agreed, like, yeah, whatever, cool, just I'll talk to you tomorrow. And so later on, we're like, of course, see, you agreed. And so he had explained to his fiance that she was leaving her for 3 months to sleep on a tiny airbed. I mean, it wasn't like tiny, but like he's like 6'5", and he slept on an airbed in Joe's room like for 3 months. And we had like no money. We're in Y Combinator now. The 3 of us are there. And if you've been to a Y Combinator class, there's like hundreds of people every year now. The last batch I went to, there were 80 companies, I think 200 people total. My batch, I think there were 12 companies.
Oh, wow.
And it was, you knew it was going to be a bad Y Combinator when Paul Graham accepted you, and then he sent you another email saying, by the way, we don't know if there will be any investors at demo day. Enter Y Combinator, and I remember the first thing Paul Graham says, I have one piece of advice for you, and that's move to Mountain View, because no startups in San Francisco. And at the time, he was kind of right. There were no startups in San Francisco. And we were like, okay, I'm not going to do that. What else is next? And it turns out all of his other advice was great, except for that very first thing. He told everyone to move to Mountain View, and I was like, that's the worst idea ever. And
there were
I
plenty
still
of
tell him.
startups in San Francisco.
Paul Graham's thing was like the huge successful startups were not in San Francisco, and Twitter was like kind of just coming on the scene. And they're like, and now you have Dropbox and Square and like all these other companies and Pinterest, and there wasn't any of that. But you had Facebook, you had Google, you had Apple, you had all these tech giants.
Right.
And his whole point was like, this is where it's happening. Yeah, there's some small companies up there, but this is where it's happening. So we're in Y Combinator, and he looks at us and he says, I don't know if there'll be any investors on demo day. So you should have on demo day, you should show them this graph, and the line should be going up and to the right, and don't label it, just because he's like really dramatic about his presentation. So he's like, just show this graph unlabeled. So it's like a big hockey stick, and then the next slide say it's not traffic, it's money, and like dollar signs go on the axis, and it's like, look, we're profitable. So he's like, that's what you got to do by demo day. And so what we did is we created this imaginary graph, and it had money on it. It was a revenue graph, and we pasted it to the bathroom mirror. And we said, this is the first thing we're going to look at when we wake up in the morning, and this is the last thing we're going to look at before we go to bed. I remember Paul Graham told us another piece of advice that I'll never forget, and I think it's a pretty good piece of advice for startups. It's better to have 100 people love you than 1 million people that sort of like you. And that actually, I think, came from Paul Buchheit. It's better to have 100 people love you than 1 million people that kind of like you. And that seems to kind of fall in the face of Silicon Valley like kind of wisdom. Because when I was starting out, everyone was talking about growth, users adoption. And when I meet with entrepreneurs, I say, don't worry about your growth. Don't worry about how many users you have. Only worry about making sure that the few you have absolutely love you. And if the few you have love you, and they are representative of a larger audience, then that's all you have to do. It's actually incredibly simple. You don't have to worry about this like mysterious like kind of growth virality mechanism. So we tell him like, well, we don't really have very many users, but we have like 100, and they're in New York City. And so he says, so you're here in Mountain View and your users are in New York. And we say, yeah. He goes, what are you still doing here? And I'm like, what? He goes, go to New York, go to your users. And we literally took it pretty literal. We would fly to New York every single weekend for 12 weeks. Joe and I would like design the site, we'd work on it, we'd give it to Nate, and Nate would be back coding, and then we would fly to New York. And one of the things we realized is we wanted to create like the dead simple way to create your listing. We felt like, what's the hardest part? Well, before like really good cameras on your phone, taking the photos was hard. So we emailed our host and we said, what if, we're offering a free professional photographer. Of course, we didn't have any money for free professional photographers, so I asked a friend from RISD if I could borrow their camera, and I was the free professional photographer. And we literally, and this was January, February in New York, would be on the subway with these cameras on our neck, like snow on our legs, like going door to door, like meeting our users, taking their photographs. But the thing that was so special is you would meet them, and you would learn about their lives. You would truly get to know your user. When you buy an iPhone, Steve Jobs wouldn't come over and sleep on your couch, but I did. And I was there. And I was literally living with our users. And I remember like one of our users, like our host, thought we were like a huge company, and he didn't realize we were a huge company until he asked how we get paid. And I said, oh, I'll just write you a check. And I pull a binder of checks and I hand it to him on his couch. And he's like, you just wrote me a check. He goes, yeah, I write all the checks for the company. Because there was a point where I personally wrote a check and a note to every single host. And that was the moment in which he, in my community, realized we were actually a pretty small company. Is I was physically writing and mailing checks to every one of the people on our website before we had like an automated payout system. So we end up going door to door, meeting our users. They end up like really embracing us and loving the product. And I remember listening to these stories and hearing these hosts who would come to us like, crying like, you saved me. And I'm like, what do you mean I saved you? What the hell are you talking about? And they said, my husband and I were going to lose our apartment. We didn't know what to do with our apartment. And then one day we listed it on your website, and now we have enough money that we can afford to like keep it. And we hear these stories, and they're really, really inspiring. And then we meet with people and we'd watch them. Because like Henry Ford, the quote, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Designers observe everything, and they're very, very observant. When you go to art school, you learn to observe. And we learned to observe, and we noticed all sorts of small things, like people didn't know how to price their place, they didn't know how to display their properties. And one by one, we started improving the website. And I remember the first day of Y Combinator, we asked ourselves, we said, on the last day of Y Combinator, if it doesn't work out, we'll just go our separate ways. Well, we never had to have that conversation.
Nate comes back, we do Y Combinator, and Nate, unfortunately, is 6'5", and he sleeps on this tiny airbed. I think it's an airbed for children, actually. And it was in our bedroom, and we would be up late into the night. Paul Graham says, you need to be profitable at demo day. We don't even know if anyone's going to be at demo day, any investors. I mean, it was a very different environment only 2 years ago. So what we did, and this is how we succeeded, we realized whatever you focus on, you get. We should focus only on one thing, and that's being profitable. So we printed out an imaginary revenue graph, and we pasted it to the bathroom mirror. We said, this is the first thing we're going to look at when we wake up in the morning. And this is the last thing we're going to look at before we go to bed. We are going to be dreaming about revenue. And we really did. We put it up on the wall, on the bathroom mirror, and we were literally up late at night, and this is halfway through Y Combinator. We meet with Paul Graham again, and he gives us another amazing piece of advice. He says, your users are meeting in person, and you're here in Mountain View. What are you still doing here? And I was like, what do you mean, what am I still doing here? And he says it again, your users are in New York, they're in DC, they're in LA. Go to your users. And we said, but that doesn't scale. We can't do that. He says, don't worry. Do things that don't scale. It will teach you. So that's exactly what we did. We started going to New York City. We went to Washington, D.C. We went to Denver. We went literally door to door, basically signing people up for our website. We'd be in coffee shops, in conversations. And I just want to point out this listing right here. What's notable is before this, we were a marketplace for people to list their bedrooms on our website. And this guy, David, basically changed our business forever. So David is Barry Manilow's drummer. Barry Manilow's drummer forever changed our business when he decided that he was going to rent his entire apartment on his website while he was on tour with Barry. And before that, we had this rule. You had to be in the place with them. You couldn't provide breakfast otherwise. Seems so silly now, I know. And this opened up a whole new market. But how did we know? Because we met him. I had no idea until I find out. And by the way, it was amazing when I get a call a couple weeks later. He's backstage on tour. I hear, Barry, Barry, and he's complaining to me they can't log into his account. I just thought this was amazing. So this was our 5th launch on demo day. And we started getting what Paul Graham calls your wiggles of hope. And we finally reached profitability, ramen profitable. But we looked at that graph every day, and we hit it a couple weeks early. And over the next couple months, people started listing their places all over the world. And today, we're actually in 8,200 cities in 166 countries. And the traffic, I only show the traffic, but everything has been taking off. But very recently, only the last basically 3, 4, 5 months. So it looks like maybe an overnight success. We now have really interesting spaces. We have this amazing apartment in Paris. This is pretty similar to what we were expecting. But we also have things like a treehouse. We have igloos. You can actually stay in this igloo. We have boats. We have water villas. We have castles. And in fact, the amazing part about this castle is people are actually throwing events here, because you're not going to just rent it out for 2 of your friends. But if you have well, maybe you will. Some of the speakers might. But people have weddings here. So we're now facilitating not just spaces to stay, but spaces to do activities, to experience. And this was pretty amazing. We actually are now getting private islands. And people are booking. We have an entire collection of private islands on our website. So basically, what we are today is a community marketplace for space. It's a really big idea, but if we, back in 2007, said we were going to create that, it would have been impossible. So basically, it started with an airbed in our living room to solve our own problem. And now people are listing all types of spaces all over the world. And so there's a big party tonight, so make sure you come.
Probably the most important single piece of advice I got, which is probably advice that is probably the most important advice I can give you, or one of the most important advice, is he basically drew out this chart. And he basically said, it's better to have 100 people that love you, 100 customers that love you, than 1 million customers that just sort of like you.